Chapter 1. Well, Pyotr, not in sight yet? Was the question asked on May the 20th, 1859, by a gentleman of a little over 40 in a dusty coat and checked trousers, who came out without his hat onto the low steps of the posting station at S. He was addressing his servant, a chubby young fellow with whitish down on his chin and little lackluster eyes. The servant, in whom everything, the turquoise ring in his ear, the streaky hair plastered with grease, and the civility of his movements, indicated a man of the new, improved generation, glanced with an air of indulgence along the road and made answer. "No, sir, not in sight." "Not in sight?" repeated his master. "No, sir," responded the man a second time. His master sighed and sat down on a little bench. We will introduce him to the reader while he sits, his feet tucked under him, gazing thoughtfully round. His name was Nikolai Petrovich Kirsanov. He had, 12 miles from the posting station, a fine property of 200 souls, or, as he expressed it, since he had arranged the division of his land with the peasants and started a farm of nearly 5,000 acres. His father, a general in the army, who served in 1812, a coarse, half-educated but not ill-natured man, a typical Russian, had been in harness all his life, first in command of a brigade and then of a division, and lived constantly in the provinces, where, by virtue of his rank, he played a fairly important part. Nikolai Petrovich was born in the south of Russia, like his elder brother, Pavel, of whom more hereafter. He was educated at home till he was 14, surrounded by cheap tutors, free and easy but toadying adjutants, and all the usual regimental and staff set. His mother, one of the Kolyazin family, as a girl called Agat, but as a general's wife, Agatoklia Kuzminishna Kirsanov, was one of those military ladies who take their full share of the duties and dignities of office. She wore gorgeous caps and rustling silk dresses. In church, she was the first to advance to the cross. She talked a great deal in a loud voice, let her children kiss her hand in the morning, and gave them her blessing at night. In fact, she got everything out of life she could. Nikolai Petrovich, as a general's son, though so far from being distinguished by courage that he even deserved to be called a coward, was intended, like his brother Pavel, to enter the army. But he broke his leg on the very day when the news of his commission came, and, after being 2 months in bed, retained a slight limp to the end of his days. His father gave him up as a bad job and let him go into the civil service. He took him to Petersburg as soon as he was 18 and placed him in the university. His brother happened about the same time to be made an officer in the Guards. The young men started living together in one set of rooms under the remote supervision of a cousin on their mother's side, Ilya Kolyazin, an official of high rank. Their father returned to his division and his wife, and only rarely sent his sons large sheets of gray paper scrawled over in a bold, clerkly hand. At the bottom of these sheets stood in letters, enclosed carefully in scrollwork, the words, Pyotr Kirsanov, General Major. In 1835, Nikolai Petrovich left the university, a graduate, and in the same year, General Kirsanov was put on the retired list after an unsuccessful review and came to Petersburg with his wife to live. He was about to take a house in the Tabrichevsky Gardens and had joined the English club, but he died suddenly of an apoplectic fit. Agatoklia Kuzminishna soon followed him. She couldn't accustom herself to a dull life in the capital. She was consumed by the ennui of existence away from the regiment. Meanwhile, Nikolai Petrovich had already, in his parents' lifetime, and to their no slight chagrin, had time to fall in love with the daughter of his landlord, a petty official, Properloviansky. She was pretty, and as it is called, an advanced girl. She used to read the serious articles in the science column of the journals. He married her as soon as the term of mourning was over, and leaving the civil service in which his father had by favor procured him a post, was perfectly blissful with his Masha. First in a country villa near the Lesny Institute, afterwards in town in a pretty little flat with a clean staircase and a drafty drawing room, and then in the country, where he settled finally, and where in a short time a son, Arkady, was born to him. The young couple lived very happily and peacefully. They were scarcely ever apart. They read together, sang and played duets together on the piano. She tended her flowers and looked after the poultry yard. He sometimes went hunting and busied himself with the estate, while Arkady grew and grew in the same happy and peaceful way. 10 years passed like a dream. In 1847, Kirsanov's wife died. He almost succumbed to this blow. In a few weeks, his hair was gray. He was getting ready to go abroad, if possible to distract his mind, but then came the year 1848. He returned unwillingly to the country, and after a rather prolonged period of inactivity, began to take an interest in improvements in the management of his land. In 1855, he brought his son to the university. He spent 3 winters with him in Petersburg, hardly going out anywhere, and trying to make acquaintance with Arkady's young companions. The last winter, he hadn't been able to go. And here we have seen him in the May of 1859, already quite gray, stoutish, and rather bent, waiting for his son, who had just taken his degree, as once he had taken it himself. The servant, from a feeling of propriety, and perhaps also not anxious to remain under the master's eye, had gone to the gate and was smoking a pipe. Nikolai Petrovich bent his head and began staring at the crumbling steps. A big mottled fowl walked sedately towards him, treading firmly with its great yellow legs. A muddy cat gave him an unfriendly look, twisting herself coyly round the railing. The sun was scorching. From the half-dark passage of the posting station came an odor of hot rye bread. Nikolai Petrovich fell to dreaming. My son, a graduate, Arkasha, were the ideas that continually came around again and again in his head. He tried to think of something else, and again the same thoughts returned. He remembered his dead wife. She didn't live to see it, he murmured sadly. A plump, dark blue pigeon flew into the road and hurriedly went to drink in a puddle near the well. Nikolai Petrovich began looking at it, but his ear had already caught the sound of approaching wheels. It sounds as if they're coming, sir, announced the servant, popping in from the gateway. Nikolai Petrovich jumped up and bent his eyes on the road. A carriage appeared with 3 posting horses harnessed abreast. In the carriage, he caught a glimpse of the blue band of a student's cap, the familiar outline of a dear face. Arkasha! Arkasha! Cried Kirsanov, and he ran, waving his hands. A few instants later, his lips were pressed to the beardless, dusty, sunburnt cheek of the youthful graduate. Chapter 2. Let me shake myself first, Daddy, said Arkady, in a voice tired from traveling, but boyish and clear as a bell, as he gaily responded to his father's caresses. I'm covering you with dust. Never mind, repeated Nikolai Petrovich, smiling tenderly. And twice he struck the collar of his son's cloak and his own greatcoat with his hand. Let me have a look at you. Let me have a look at you, he added, moving back from him, but immediately he went with hurried steps towards the yard of the station, calling, this way, and horses at once. Nikolai Petrovich seemed far more excited than his son. He seemed a little confused, a little timid. Arkady stopped him. "Daddy," he said, "let me introduce you to my great friend, Bazarov, about whom I have so often written to you. He's been so good as to promise to stay with us." Nikolai Petrovich went back quickly, and going up to a tall man in a long, loose, rough coat with tassels, who had only just got out of the carriage, he warmly pressed the ungloved red hand, which the latter did not at once hold out to him. "I am heartily glad," he began, "and very grateful for your kind intention of visiting us. Let me know your name and your father's." "Yevgeny Vasilyev," answered Bazarov, in a lazy but manly voice. And turning back the collar of his rough coat, he showed Nikolai Petrovich his whole face. It was long and lean, with a broad forehead, a nose flat at the base and sharper at the end, large greenish eyes, and drooping whiskers of a sandy color. It was lighted up by a tranquil smile, and showed self-confidence and intelligence. "I hope, dear Yevgeny Vasilyevich, you won't be bored with us," continued Nikolai Petrovich. Bazarov's thin lips moved just perceptibly, though he made no reply, but merely took off his cap. His long, thick hair didn't hide the prominent bumps on his head. "Then, Arkady," Nikolai Petrovich began again, turning to his son, "shall the horses be put to at once, or would you like to rest?" "We will rest at home, Daddy. Tell them to harness the horses." "At once? At once?" his father assented. "Hey, Pyotr, do you hear? Get things ready, my good boy. Look sharp." Pyotr, who as a modernized servant had not kissed the young master's hand, but only bowed to him from a distance, again vanished through the gateway. "I came here with the carriage, but there are 3 horses for your coach, too," said Nikolai Petrovich fussily, while Arkady drank some water from an iron dipper brought him by the woman in charge of the station, and Bazarov began smoking a pipe, and went up to the driver who was taking out the horses. "There are only 2 seats in the carriage, and I don't know how your friend—" "He will go in the coach," interposed Arkady in an undertone. "You must not stand on ceremony with him, please. He's a splendid fellow, so simple. You'll see." Nikolai Petrovich's coachman brought the horses around. "Come, hurry up, Bushy Beard," said Bazarov, addressing the driver. "Do you hear, Mityucha?" put in another driver, standing by with his hands thrust behind him into the opening of his sheepskin coat. "But the gentleman called you. It's Bushy Beard you are, too." Mityucha only gave a jog to his hat and pulled the reins off the heated shaft horse. Look sharp, lads, lend a hand," cried Nikolai Petrovich. "There'll be something to drink our health with." In a few minutes, the horses were harnessed. The father and son were installed in the carriage. Pyotr climbed up onto the box. Bazarov jumped into the coach and nestled his head down into the leather cushion. And both the vehicles rolled away. Chapter 3. "So here you are, a graduate at last, and come home again," said Nikolai Petrovich, touching Arkady now on the shoulder, now on the knee. "At last. And how is Uncle? Quite well?" asked Arkady, who, in spite of the genuine, almost childish delight filling his heart, wanted as soon as possible to turn the conversation from the emotional into a commonplace channel. "Quite well. He was thinking of coming with me to meet you, but for some reason or other he gave up the idea." "And how long have you been waiting for me?" inquired Arkady. "Oh, about 5 hours." "Dear old Dad." Arkady turned around quickly to his father and gave him a sounding kiss on the cheek. Nikolai Petrovich gave vent to a low chuckle. "I have got such a capital horse for you," he began. "You'll see. And your room has been fresh papered." "And is there a room for Bazarov?" "We will find one for him, too." "Please, Dad, make much of it. I can't tell you how I prize his friendship." Have you made friends with him lately? Yes, quite lately. Ah, that's how it is. I didn't see him last winter. What does he study? His chief subject is natural science, but he knows everything. Next year he wants to take his doctor's degree. Ah, he's in the medical faculty, observed Nikolai Petrovich, and he was silent for a little. Pyotr, he went on, stretching out his hand, aren't those our peasants driving along? Pyotr looked where his master was pointing. Some carts harnessed with unbridled horses were moving rapidly along a narrow byroad. In each cart, there were one or two peasants in sheepskin coats, unbuttoned. Yes, sir, replied Pyotr. Where are they going? To the town? To the town, I suppose. To the gin shop, he added contemptuously, turning slightly towards the coachman as though he would appeal to him. But the latter didn't stir a muscle. He was a man of the old stamp, and didn't share the modern views of the younger generation. I have had a lot of bother with the peasants this year, pursued Nikolai Petrovich, turning to his son. They won't pay their rent. What is one to do? But do you like your hired laborers? Yes, said Nikolai Petrovich between his teeth. They're being set against me, that's the mischief, and they don't do their best. They spoil the tools. But they have tilled the land pretty fairly. When things have settled down a bit, it will be all right. Do you take an interest in farming now? You've no shade. That's a pity, remarked Arkady, without answering the last question. I have had a great awning put up on the north side over the balcony, observed Nikolai Petrovich. Now we can have dinner even in the open air. It'll be rather too like a summer villa. Still, that's all nonsense. What air, though, here. How delicious it smells. Really, I fancy there's nowhere such fragrance in the world as in the meadows here, and the sky, too. Arkady suddenly stopped short, cast a stealthy look behind him, and said no more. Of course, observed Nikolai Petrovich, you were born here, and so everything is bound to strike you in a special... Come, Dad, that makes no difference where a man is born. Still, no, it makes absolutely no difference. Nikolai Petrovich gave a sidelong glance at his son, and the carriage went on half a mile farther before the conversation was renewed between them. I don't recollect whether I wrote to you, began Nikolai Petrovich. Your old nurse, Yegorovna, is dead. Really? Poor thing. Is Prokofych still living? Yes, and not a bit changed. As grumbling as ever. In fact, you won't find many changes in Mariyino. Have you still the same steward? Well, to be sure there is a change there. I decided not to keep about me any freed serfs who have been house servants, or at least not to entrust them with duties of any responsibility. Arkady glanced towards Pyotr. Il est libre en effet, observed Nikolai Petrovich in an undertone. But you see, he's only a valet. Now I have a steward, a townsman. He seems a practical fellow. I pay him 250 rubles a year, but, added Nikolai Petrovich, rubbing his forehead and eyebrows with his hand, which was always an indication with him of inward embarrassment, I told you just now that you wouldn't find changes at Mariyino. That's not quite correct. I think it my duty to prepare you, though... He hesitated for an instant and then went on in French. A severe moralist would regard my openness as improper, but in the first place, it can't be concealed. And secondly, you are aware I have always had peculiar ideas as regards the relation of father and son. Though, of course, you would be right in blaming me. At my age. In short, that girl about whom you have probably heard already. Fenichka? Asked Arkady easily. Nikolai Petrovich blushed. Don't mention her name aloud, please. Well, she is living with me now. I have installed her in the house. There were 2 little rooms there, but that can all be changed. Goodness, Daddy, what for? Your friend is going to stay with us. It would be awkward. Please don't be uneasy on Bazarov's account. He's above all that. Well, but you too, added Nikolai Petrovich. The little lodge is so horrid. That's the worst of it. Goodness, Dad, interposed Arkady. It's as if you were apologizing. I wonder you're not ashamed. Of course, I ought to be ashamed, answered Nikolai Petrovich, flushing more and more. Nonsense, Dad, nonsense. Please don't. Arkady smiled affectionately. What a thing to apologize for, he thought to himself. And his heart was filled with a feeling of condescending tenderness for his kind, soft-hearted father, mixed with a sense of secret superiority. Please stop, he repeated once more, instinctively reveling in the consciousness of his own advanced and emancipated condition. Nikolai Petrovich glanced at him from under the fingers of the hand with which he was still rubbing his forehead, and there was a pang in his heart. But at once he blamed himself for it. Here are our meadows at last, he said after a long silence. And that in front is our forest, isn't it? Asked Arkady. Yes, only I have sold the timber. This year they will cut it down. Why did you sell it? The money was needed. Besides, that land is to go to the peasants, who don't pay you their rent. That's their affair. Besides, they will pay it someday. I'm sorry about the forest, observed Arkady. And he began to look about him. The country through which they were driving couldn't be called picturesque. Fields upon fields stretched all along to the very horizon, now sloping gently upwards, then dropping down again. In some places, woods were to be seen, and winding ravines planted with low, scanty bushes, recalling vividly the representation of them on the old-fashioned maps of the times of Catherine. They came upon little streams, too, with hollow banks, and tiny lakes with narrow dikes, and little villages with low hovels under dark and often tumble-down roofs, and slanting barns with walls woven of brushwood and gaping doorways beside neglected threshing floors, and churches, some brick-built with stucco peeling off in patches, others wooden with crosses fallen askew and overgrown graveyards. Slowly, Arkady's heart sank. To complete the picture, the peasants they met were all in tatters, and on the sorriest little nags. The willows, with their trunks stripped of bark and broken branches, stood like ragged beggars along the roadside. Cows, lean and shaggy and looking pinched up by hunger, were greedily tearing at the grass along the ditches. They looked as though they had just been snatched out of the murderous clutches of some threatening monster. And the piteous state of the weak, starved beasts in the midst of the lovely spring day called up like a white phantom the endless, comfortless winter, with its storms and frosts and snows. No, thought Arkady, this isn't a rich country. It doesn't impress one by plenty or industry. It can't go on like this. Reforms are absolutely necessary. But how is one to carry them out? How is one to begin? Such were Arkady's reflections. But even as he reflected, the spring regained its sway. All around was golden green. All, trees, bushes, grass, shone and stirred gently in wide waves under the soft breath of the warm wind. From all sides flooded the endless, trilling music of the larks. The peewits were calling as they hovered over the low-lying meadows or noiselessly ran over the tussocks of grass. The rooks strutted among the half-grown short spring corn. standing out black against its tender green. They disappeared in the already whitening rye, only from time to time their heads peeped out amid its gray waves. Arkady gazed and gazed, and his reflections grew slowly fainter and passed away. He flung off his coat and turned to his father with a face so bright and boyish that the latter gave him another hug. "We're not far off now," remarked Nikolai Petrovich. "We have only to get up this hill and the house will be in sight. We shall get on together splendidly, Arkasha. You shall help me in farming the estate, if it isn't a bore to you. We must draw close to one another now and learn to know each other thoroughly, mustn't we?" "Of course," said Arkady. "But what an exquisite day it is today." "To welcome you, my dear boy. Yes, it's spring in its full loveliness. Though I agree with Pushkin. Do you remember in Yevgeny Onegin, 'To me, how sad thy coming is. Spring, spring, sweet time of love.' What?" "Arkady," called Bazarov's voice from the coach. "Send me a match. I've nothing to light my pipe with." Nikolai Petrovich stopped, while Arkady, who had begun listening to him with some surprise, though with sympathy too, made haste to pull a silver matchbox out of his pocket and sent it to Bazarov by Pyotr. "Will you have a cigar?" shouted Bazarov again. "Thanks," answered Arkady. Pyotr returned to the carriage and handed him with the matchbox a thick black cigar, which Arkady began to smoke promptly, diffusing about him such a strong and pungent odor of cheap tobacco that Nikolai Petrovich, who had never been a smoker from his youth up, was forced to turn away his head, as imperceptibly as he could, for fear of wounding his son. A quarter of an hour later, the two carriages drew up before the steps of a new wooden house, painted gray with a red iron roof. This was Mariino, also known as New Wick, or, as the peasants had nicknamed it, Poverty Farm. Chapter 4. No crowd of house serfs ran out onto the steps to meet the gentleman. A little girl of 12 years old made her appearance alone. After her, there came out of the house a young lad, very like Pyotr, dressed in a coat of gray livery with white armorial buttons, the servant of Pavel Petrovich Kirsanov. Without speaking, he opened the door of the carriage and unbuttoned the apron of the coach. Nikolai Petrovich, with his son, and Bazarov walked through a dark and almost empty hall, from behind the door of which they caught a glimpse of a young woman's face, into a drawing room furnished in the most modern style. "Here we are at home," said Nikolai Petrovich, taking off his cap and shaking back his hair. "That's the great thing. Now we must have supper and rest." "A meal wouldn't come amiss, certainly," observed Bazarov, stretching, and he dropped onto a sofa. Yes, let us have supper directly." Nikolai Petrovich, with no apparent reason, stamped his foot. "And here, just at the right moment, comes Prokofyich." A man about 60 entered, white-haired, thin and swarthy, in a cinnamon-colored dress coat with brass buttons and a pink neckerchief. He smirked, went up to kiss Arkady's hand, and bowing to the guest, retreated to the door and put his hand behind him. "Here he is, Prokofyich," began Nikolai Petrovich. "He's come back to us at last. Well, how do you think him looking?" "As well as could be," said the old man, and was grinning again, but he quickly knitted his bushy brows. "You wish supper to be served?" he said impressively. Yes, please. But won't you like to go to your room first, Yevgeny Vasilyevich?" "No, thanks, I don't care about it. Only give orders for my little box to be taken there, and this garment, too," he added, taking off his frieze overcoat. "Certainly. Prokofyich, take the gentleman's coat." Prokofyich, with an air of perplexity, picked up Bazarov's garment in both hands, and holding it high above his head, retreated on tiptoe. And you, Arkady, are you going to your room for a minute? Yes, I must wash, answered Arkady, and was just moving towards the door, but at that instant there came into the drawing room a man of medium height, dressed in a dark English suit, a fashionable low cravat, and kid shoes. Pavel Petrovich Kirsanov. He looked about 45. His close-cropped gray hair shone with a dark luster, like new silver. His face, yellow but free from wrinkles, was exceptionally regular and pure in line, as though carved by a light and delicate chisel, and showed traces of remarkable beauty. Especially fine were his clear, black, almond-shaped eyes. The whole person of Arkady's uncle, with its aristocratic elegance, had preserved the gracefulness of youth and that air of striving upwards, away from earth, which for the most part is lost after the 20s are past. Pavel Petrovich took out of his trouser pocket his exquisite hand with its long, tapering, pink nails, a hand which seemed still more exquisite from the snowy whiteness of the cuff, buttoned with a single big opal, and gave it to his nephew. After a preliminary handshake in the European style, he kissed him thrice after the Russian fashion, that is to say, he touched his cheek 3 times with his perfumed mustaches, and said, "Welcome." Nikolai Petrovich presented him to Bazarov. Pavel Petrovich greeted him with a slight inclination of his supple figure and a slight smile, but he did not give him his hand, and even put it back into his pocket. "I had begun to think you were not coming today," he began in a musical voice, with a genial swing and shrug of the shoulders as he showed his splendid white teeth. "Did anything happen on the road?" "Nothing happened," answered Arkady. "We were rather slow, but we're as hungry as wolves now. Hurry up, Prokofych, Dad, and I'll be back directly." "Stay, I'm coming with you," cried Bazarov, pulling himself up suddenly from the sofa. Both the young men went out. "Who is he?" asked Pavel Petrovich. "A friend of Arkasha's. According to him, a very clever fellow." "Is he going to stay with us?" "Yes." "That unkempt creature?" "Why, yes." Pavel Petrovich drummed with his fingertips on the table. "I fancy Arkady Sedegourdi," he remarked. "I'm glad he has come back." At supper there was little conversation. Bazarov especially said nothing, but he ate a great deal. Nikolai Petrovich related various incidents in what he called his career as a farmer, talked about the impending government measures, about committees, deputations, the necessity of introducing machinery, etc. Pavel Petrovich paced slowly up and down the dining room. He never ate supper, sometimes sipping at a wine glass of red wine, and less often uttering some remark, or rather exclamation, of the nature of, "Ah, uh-huh, Arkady told some news from Petersburg, but he was conscious of a little awkwardness. That awkwardness which usually overtakes a youth when he has just ceased to be a child, and has come back to a place where they are accustomed to regard him and treat him as a child. He made his sentences quite unnecessarily long, avoided the word daddy, and even sometimes replaced it by the word father, mumbled, it's true, between his teeth. With an exaggerated carelessness, he poured into his glass far more wine than he really wanted, and drank it all off. Prokofych didn't take his eyes off him, and kept chewing his lips. After supper, they all separated at once. "Your uncle's a queer fish," Bazarov said to Arkady as he sat in his dressing gown by his bedside, smoking a short pipe. "Only fancy such style in the country. His nails. You ought to send them to an exhibition." Why, of course you don't know, replied Arkady. He was a great swell in his own day, you know. I'll tell you his story one day. He was very handsome, you know. He used to turn all the women's heads. Oh, that's it, is it? So he keeps it up in memory of the past. It's a pity there's no one for him to fascinate here, though. I kept staring at his exquisite collars. They're like marble. And his chin's shaved simply to perfection. Come, Arkady Nikolaevich, isn't that ridiculous? Perhaps it is. But he's a splendid man, really. An antique survival. But your father's a capital fellow. He wastes his time reading poetry and doesn't know much about farming, but he's a good-hearted fellow. My father's a man in 1,000. Did you notice how shy and nervous he is? Arkady shook his head, as though he himself weren't shy and nervous. It's something astonishing, pursued Bazarov. These old idealists, they develop their nervous systems till they break down, so balance is lost. But good night. In my room there's an English washstand, but the door won't fasten. Anyway, that ought to be encouraged. An English washstand stands for progress. Bazarov went away, and a sense of great happiness came over Arkady. It's sweet to fall asleep in one's own home, in the familiar bed, under the quilt worked by loving hands. Perhaps a dear nurse's hands, those kind, tender, untiring hands. Arkady remembered Yegorovna and sighed, and wished her peace in heaven. For himself, he made no prayer. Both he and Bazarov were soon asleep, but others in the house were awake long after. His son's return had agitated Nikolai Petrovich. He lay down in bed, but didn't put out the candles, and his head propped on his hand, he fell into long reveries. His brother was sitting long after midnight in his study in a wide armchair before the fireplace, on which there smoldered some faintly glowing embers. Pavel Petrovich was not undressed. Only some red Chinese slippers had replaced the kid shoes on his feet. He held in his hand the last number of Galignani, but he was not reading. He gazed fixedly into the grate, where a bluish flame flickered, dying down, then flaring up again. God knows where his thoughts were rambling, but they were not rambling in the past only. The expression of his face was concentrated and surly, which isn't the way when a man is absorbed solely in recollections. In a small back room, there sat, on a large chest, a young woman in a blue dressing jacket with a white kerchief thrown over her dark hair. Fenichka. She was half listening, half dozing, and often looked across towards the open door through which a child's cradle was visible, and the regular breathing of a sleeping baby could be heard. Chapter 5. The next morning, Bazarov woke up earlier than anyone and went out of the house. Oh my, he thought, looking about him. The little place isn't much to boast of. When Nikolai Petrovich had divided the land with his peasants, he had had to build his new manor house on 4 acres of perfectly flat and barren land. He had built a house, offices, and farm buildings, laid out a garden, dug a pond, and sunk 2 wells. But the young trees hadn't done well. Very little water had collected in the pond, and that in the wells tasted brackish. Only 1 arbor of lilac and acacia had grown fairly well. They sometimes had tea and dinner in it. In a few minutes, Bazarov had traversed all the little paths of the garden. He went into the cattle yard and the stable, routed out 2 farm boys with whom he made friends at once, and set off with them to a small swamp about a mile from the house to look for frogs. "What do you want frogs for, sir?" one of the boys asked him. I'll tell you what for, answered Bazarov, who possessed the special faculty of inspiring confidence in people of a lower class, though he never tried to win them, and behaved very casually with them. I shall cut the frog open and see what's going on in his inside. And then, as you and I are much the same as frogs, only that we walk on legs, I shall know what's going on inside us, too. And what do you want to know that for? So as not to make a mistake if you're taken ill and I have to cure you. Are you a doctor, then? Yes. Vaska, do you hear? The gentleman says you and I are the same as frogs. That's funny. I'm afraid of frogs, observed Vaska, a boy of 7, with a head as white as flax, and bare feet, dressed in a gray smock with a stand-up collar. What is there to be afraid of? Do they bite? There, paddle into the water, philosophers, said Bazarov. Meanwhile, Nikolai Petrovich, too, had waked up and gone in to see Arkady, whom he found dressed. The father and son went out onto the terrace under the shelter of the awning. Near the balustrade, on the table, among great bunches of lilac, the samovar was already boiling. A little girl came up, the same who had been the first to meet them at the steps on their arrival the evening before. In a shrill voice, she said, Fedosia Nikolaevna is not quite well. She cannot come. She gave orders to ask you, will you please to pour out tea yourself, or should she send Dunyasha? I will pour out myself, interposed Nikolai Petrovich hurriedly. Arkady, how do you take your tea, with cream or with lemon? With cream, answered Arkady. And after a brief silence, he uttered interrogatively, Daddy? Nikolai Petrovich, in confusion, looked at his son. Well, he said. Arkady dropped his eyes. Forgive me, Dad, if my question seems unsuitable to you, he began. But you yourself, by your openness yesterday, encouraged me to be open. You won't be angry? Go on. You give me confidence to ask you. Isn't the reason she will not come here to pour out tea because I'm here? Nikolai Petrovich turned slightly away. Perhaps, he said at last, she supposes she is ashamed. Arkady turned a rapid glance on his father. She has no need to be ashamed. In the first place, you're aware of my views. It was very sweet to Arkady to utter that word. And secondly, could I be willing to hamper your life, your habits, in the least thing? Besides, I'm sure you couldn't make a bad choice if you have allowed her to live under the same roof with you. She must be worthy of it. In any case, a son can't judge his father, least of all I, and least of all such a father who, like you, has never hampered my liberty in anything. Arkady's voice had been shaky at the beginning. He felt himself magnanimous, though at the same time he realized he was delivering something of the nature of a lecture to his father. But the sound of one's own voice has a powerful effect on any man. And Arkady brought out his last words resolutely, even with emphasis. Thanks, Arkasha, said Nikolai Petrovich thickly, and his fingers again strayed over his eyebrows and forehead. Your suppositions are just, in fact. Of course, if this girl had not deserved... It is not a frivolous caprice. It's not easy for me to talk to you about this, but you will understand that it's difficult for her to come here in your presence, especially the first day of your return. In that case, I'll go to her, cried Arkady, with a fresh rush of magnanimous feeling, and he jumped up from his seat. I will explain to her that she has no need to be ashamed before me. Nikolai Petrovich, too, got up. Arkady, he began, be so good. How can... I haven't told you yet. But Arkady didn't listen to him and ran off the terrace. Nikolai Petrovich looked after him and sank into his chair, overcome by confusion. His heart began to throb. Did he, at that moment, realize the inevitable strangeness of the future relations between him and his son? Was he conscious that Arkady would perhaps have shown him more respect if he had never touched on this subject at all? Did he reproach himself for weakness? It's hard to say. All these feelings were within him, but in the state of sensations and vague sensations, while the flush didn't leave his face and his heart throbbed. There was the sound of hurrying footsteps, and Arkady came onto the terrace. "We've made friends, Dad," he cried, with an expression of a kind of affectionate and good-natured triumph on his face. "Fedosia Nikolaevna is not quite well today, really, and she will come a little later. But why didn't you tell me I had a brother? I should have kissed him last night as I have kissed him just now." Nikolai Petrovich tried to articulate something, tried to get up and open his arms. Arkady flung himself on his neck. "What's this? Embracing again?" sounded the voice of Pavel Petrovich behind them. Father and son were equally rejoiced at his appearance at that instant. There are positions genuinely affecting, from which one longs to escape as soon as possible. "Why should you be surprised at that?" said Nikolai Petrovich gaily. "Think what ages I have been waiting for Arkasha. I've not had time to get a good look at him since yesterday." "I'm not at all surprised," observed Pavel Petrovich. "I feel not indisposed to be embracing him myself." Arkady went up to his uncle, and again felt his cheeks caressed by his perfumed mustache. Pavel Petrovich sat down to the table. He wore an elegant morning suit in the English style, and a gay little fez on his head. This fez and the carelessly tied little cravat carried a suggestion of the freedom of country life. But the stiff collars of his shirt, not white, it's true, but striped, as is correct in morning dress, stood up as inexorably as ever against his well-shaved chin. "Where's your new friend?" he asked Arkady. "He's not in the house. He usually gets up early and goes off somewhere. The great thing is, we mustn't pay any attention to him. He doesn't like ceremony." "Yes, that's obvious." Pavel Petrovich began deliberately spreading butter on his bread. "Is he going to stay long with us?" "Perhaps. He came here on the way to his father's." "And where does his father live?" "In our province, 64 miles from here. He has a small property there. He was formerly an army doctor." Tut, 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 to be sure, I kept asking myself, where have I heard that name, Bazarov? "Nikolai, do you remember, in our father's division there was a surgeon, Bazarov?" "I believe there was." Yes, to be sure. So that surgeon was his father. Pavel Petrovich pulled his mustaches. "Well, and what is Mr. Bazarov himself?" he asked deliberately. "What is Bazarov?" Arkady smiled. "Would you like me, uncle, to tell you what he really is? If you will be so good, nephew?" "He's a nihilist." "Eh?" inquired Nikolai Petrovich, while Pavel Petrovich lifted a knife in the air with a small piece of butter on its tip and remained motionless. "He's a nihilist," repeated Arkady. "A nihilist," said Nikolai Petrovich. "That's from the Latin nihil, nothing, as far as I can judge. The word must mean a man who accepts nothing. Say, who respects nothing," put in Pavel Petrovich, and he set to work on the butter again. "Who regards everything from the critical point of view," observed Arkady. "Isn't that just the same thing?" inquired Pavel Petrovich. "No, it's not the same thing. A nihilist is a man who doesn't bow down before any authority, who doesn't take any principle on faith, whatever reverence that principle may be enshrined in. Well, and is that good? Interrupted Pavel Petrovich. That depends on them. Some people it will do good too, but some people will suffer for it. Indeed. Well, I see it's not in our line. We are old-fashioned people. We imagine that without principles, taken, as you say, on faith, there's no taking a step, no breathing. Vous avez changé tout cela. God give you good health and the rank of a general, while we will be content to look on and admire worthy... What was it? Nihilists, Arkady said, speaking very distinctly. Yes, there used to be Hegelists, and now there are nihilists. We shall see how you will exist in void, in vacuum. And now, ring, please, Brother Nikolai Petrovich. It's time I had my cocoa. Nikolai Petrovich rang the bell and called, Dunyasha! But instead of Dunyasha, Fenichka herself came onto the terrace. She was a young woman, about 23, with a white, soft skin, dark hair and eyes, red, childishly pouting lips, and little delicate hands. She wore a neat print dress. A new blue kerchief lay lightly on her plump shoulders. She carried a large cup of cocoa, and setting it down before Pavel Petrovich, she was overwhelmed with confusion. The hot blood rushed in a wave of crimson over the delicate skin of her pretty face. She dropped her eyes and stood at the table, leaning a little on the very tips of her fingers. It seemed as though she were ashamed of having come in, and at the same time felt that she had a right to come. Pavel Petrovich knitted his brows severely while Nikolai Petrovich looked embarrassed. Good morning, Fenichka, he muttered through his teeth. Good morning, she replied in a voice not loud but resonant, and with a sidelong glance at Arkady, who gave her a friendly smile. She went gently away. She walked with a slightly rolling gait, but even that suited her. For some minutes, silence reigned on the terrace. Pavel Petrovich sipped his cocoa. Suddenly he raised his head. Here is Sir Nihilist coming towards us, he said in an undertone. Bazarov was in fact approaching through the garden, stepping over the flower bed. His linen coat and trousers were besmeared with mud. Clinging marsh weed was twined round the crown of his old round hat. In his right hand he held a small bag. In the bag, something alive was moving. He quickly drew near the terrace and said with a nod, Good morning, gentlemen. Sorry I was late for tea. I'll be back directly. I must just put these captives away. What have you there? Leeches? Asked Pavel Petrovich. No, frogs. Do you eat them or keep them? For experiment, said Bazarov indifferently. And he went off into the house. So he's going to cut them up, observed Pavel Petrovich. He has no faith in principles, but he has faith in frogs. Arkady looked compassionately at his uncle. Nikolai Petrovich shrugged his shoulders stealthily. Pavel Petrovich himself felt that his epigram was unsuccessful and began to talk about husbandry and the new steward who had come to him the evening before to complain that a laborer, Foma, was debauched and quite unmanageable. He's such an Aesop, he said among other things. In all places he has protested himself a worthless fellow. He's not a man to keep his place. He'll walk off in a huff, like a fool. Chapter 6. Bazarov came back, sat down to the table, and began hastily drinking tea. The two brothers looked at him in silence, while Arkady stealthily watched first his father and then his uncle. Did you walk far from here? Nikolai Petrovich asked at last. Where you've a little swamp near the aspen wood. I started some half-dozen snipe. You might slaughter them, Arkady. Aren't you a sportsman, then? No. Is your special study physics? Pavel Petrovich, in his turn, inquired. Physics, yes, and natural science in general. They say the Teutons of late have had great success in that line. Yes, the Germans are our teachers in it, Bazarov answered carelessly. The word Teutons instead of Germans, Pavel Petrovich had used with ironical intention. None noticed it, however. Have you such a high opinion of the Germans? Said Pavel Petrovich with exaggerated courtesy. He was beginning to feel a secret irritation. His aristocratic nature was revolted by Bazarov's absolute nonchalance. This surgeon's son was not only not overawed, he even gave abrupt and indifferent answers. And in the tone of his voice there was something churlish, almost insolent. The scientific men there are a clever lot. To be sure, of Russian scientific men you have not such a flattering opinion, I dare say. That's very likely. That's very praiseworthy self-abnegation, Pavel Petrovich declared, drawing himself up and throwing his head back. But how is this? Arkady Nikolaevich was telling us just now that you accept no authorities. Don't you believe in them? And how am I accepting them? And what am I to believe in? They tell me the truth. I agree, that's all. And do all Germans tell the truth? Said Pavel Petrovich. And his face assumed an expression as unsympathetic, as remote, as if he had withdrawn to some cloudy height. Not all, replied Bazarov with a short yawn. He obviously didn't care to continue the discussion. Pavel Petrovich glanced at Arkady as though he would say to him, "Your friend's polite, I must say." "For my own part," he began again, not without some effort, "I am so unregenerate as not to like Germans. Russian Germans I am not speaking of now. We all know what sort of creatures they are, but even German Germans are not to my liking. In former days there were some here and there. They had, well, Schiller, to be sure, Goethe. My brother, he takes a particularly favorable view of them. But now they have all turned chemists and materialists." "A good chemist is 20 times as useful as any poet," broke in Bazarov. "Oh, indeed," commented Pavel Petrovich, and as though falling asleep, he faintly raised his eyebrows. "You don't acknowledge art, then, I suppose?" "The art of making money or of advertising pills," cried Bazarov with a contemptuous laugh. You are pleased to jest, I see. You reject all that, no doubt. Granted. Then you believe in science only? I've already explained to you that I don't believe in anything. And what is science? Science in the abstract. There are sciences as there are trades and crafts. But abstract science doesn't exist at all. Very good. Well, and in regard to the other traditions accepted in human conduct, do you maintain the same negative attitude? What's this, an examination? Asked Bazarov. Pavel Petrovich turned slightly pale. Nikolai Petrovich thought it his duty to interpose in the conversation. We will converse on this subject with you more in detail someday, dear Yevgeny Vasilievich. We will hear your views and express our own. For my part, I am heartily glad you are studying the natural sciences. I have heard that Liebig has made some wonderful discoveries in the amelioration of soils. You can be of assistance to me in my agricultural labors. You can give me some useful advice. I am at your service, Nikolai Petrovich. But Liebig's miles over our heads. One has first to learn the ABC and then begin to read, and we haven't set eyes on the alphabet yet. You are certainly a nihilist, I see that, thought Nikolai Petrovich. Still, you will allow me to apply to you on occasion. he added aloud. And now I fancy, brother, it's time for us to be going to have a talk with the steward. Pavel Petrovich got up from his seat. Yes, he said without looking at anyone. It's a misfortune to live 5 years in the country like this, far from mighty intellects. You turn into a fool directly. You may try not to forget what you've been taught, but in a snap they'll prove all that's rubbish and tell you that sensible men have nothing more to do with such foolishness, and that you, if you please, are an antiquated old fogey. What's to be done? Young people, of course, are cleverer than we are. Pavel Petrovich turned slowly on his heels and slowly walked away. Nikolai Petrovich went after him. Is he always like that? Bazarov coolly inquired of Arkady, as soon as the door had closed behind the two brothers. I must say, Evgeny, you weren't nice to him, remarked Arkady. You hurt his feelings. Well, am I going to consider them, these provincial aristocrats? It's all vanity, dandy habits, fatuity. He should have continued his career in Petersburg if that's his bent. But there, enough of him. I found a rather rare species of a water beetle, Disticus marginalis. Do you know it? I'll show you. I promised to tell you his story, began Arkady. The story of the beetle? Come, don't, Yevgeny. The story of my uncle. You will see he's not the sort of man you fancy. He deserves pity rather than ridicule. I don't dispute it. But why are you worrying over him? One ought to be just, Yevgeny. How does that follow? No, listen. And Arkady told him his uncle's story. The reader will find it in the following chapter.